The world's 11th largest economy with a GNI per capita of 30,000 US dollars, which achieved the miracle of the Han River. Korea, the first country in the world to have transformed from a recipient of official development assistance to a significant donor. Here in Seoul, the capital city of Korea, is the chamber that delves deeper into what's happening around Korea from an economic perspective. I'm your host, Panita Bajaj. This week, we prospect the global economy and the role of the World Bank in supporting the economic development of developing countries with World Bank Korea Office Special Representative Soh Hoon-seob. So for those of you interested in Korea's economy and what goes on around the world, we are here in Seoul, the economic hub of Northeast Asia. So let's get to it and step into the chamber. Joining us on this week's episode of The Chamber, we have Hoon-seob, the Special Representative of the World Bank Group Korea Office. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah.
Very happy to be here.
Sure, I heard it took an hour to get here.
A short hour.
Short hour. Office over in Incheon. We're very glad to have you here. Now, the World Bank is one of the three major international financial institutions, including, the International Monetary Fund.
Yes.
Got the WTO and so on with the UN and things of that nature. So would you like to share with our viewers what the role of World Bank Group plays exactly and why it was founded?
Sure, I'd love to. So the World Bank is an international development bank. So our mission is to support developing countries develop to become higher income developed countries. And so we do this mainly by being a bank, which means we provide loans. And for very poor countries, we also provide grants. And these are usually associated with development projects. So we would support projects, let's say in the education sector, to build schools, to upgrade teacher capabilities, to reform the entire education system, for instance. So these are development projects backed by our loans, which are below market rates, to help the developing countries take care of their development needs. The bank was established or conceived in 1944. At the Bretton Woods Conference. So this conference was a gathering of world leaders after World War II to design and think about what the international financial architecture should be after World War II. And out of this conference was conceived the idea for the World Bank. And in fact, the World Bank initially was mainly to assist Europe after World War II in terms of reconstruction of Europe. And also in this Bretton Woods Conference was conceived the idea of the IMF, International Monetary Fund. And the fund is essentially sort of the international monetary partner of the World Bank. So their main mission is to ensure international macro stability, and at that time in particular, exchange rate stability. So the two institutions are, of course, quite complementary. And we work closely together to ensure global growth and economic prosperity.
Right, I'm glad that you mentioned that because in my head they're quite similar. So I often wondered what the main difference is between the two. Can you shorten it in a brief
summary?
Well, I can't speak for the fund.
Right.
But basically, what the IMF does is they assess a country's macroeconomic stability. Typically, that's done through something called an Article 4 assessment, including advanced countries such as Korea. Through this assessment, if there's a conclusion that some reforms need to be made to improve management of the macroeconomy, so management of inflation, let's say a fiscal or external balance meaning trade deficits, for instance, how the country manages its exchange rate, its currency. This is the job of the IMF. Now, the World Bank, we are a development bank, so in some sense, we're a little bit more micro in nature. The example that I gave of an education project, I think is a typical example of some of the work that we do. But the bank, I would say, in terms of the mandate and the coverage of areas that we work in, is much broader than the fund. So the fund is much more focused on macroeconomic issues, and the bank may work on a wide range of issues, including infrastructure, developing agriculture, promoting private sector development, investing in human capital, meaning education, health, improving social protection systems. We also do a lot of work on global goods, such as climate change, working on fragile states, for instance. We have a department dedicated to working just on fragile and conflict-affected states, and gender issues, for instance. So I think the bank has a broader mandate, and if I may characterize as the bank vis-a-vis the IMF, the bank being a little bit more micro in nature in its intervention.
The World Bank, it is a bank providing financial help as well, but also sustainable solutions. So it's kind of a international development agency as well, rather than a bank, however. But it's been conducting a lot of different types of projects to improve the quality of life and livelihoods of, as you said, vulnerable people groups, people living below extreme poverty line and things of that nature, less than $1.25 a day. And that is the goal, to reduce that to 3%.
Less than 3% of the population.
3%.
Extreme, that's how we define extreme poverty. Although I think that international poverty line is now $1.90, so it's been adjusted up a little bit. But yes, we have something called the twin goals. So one is to reduce or eliminate extreme poverty, the way you defined it, eliminate meaning less than 3% of the population. And then also we have a goal to promote shared prosperity, which means we focus more on the bottom 40% of the population to make sure that their income is growing as the economy is growing. But yes, poverty is basically our main mission as a development institution.
Now, the World Bank runs its offices in many countries. I mean, you were in Beijing a couple of years back as well.
Yes.
And Korea, I mean, fairly new, opened back in 2013. What do you think was the founding purpose of the office? We talked about the brief history, 70 years plus of this World Bank, and 2013, it seems quite late in a certain way.
Well, it's late because Korea actually was a large recipient of ODA, including the World Bank projects, for a very long time, because Korea was, in fact, a very poor country. Korea suffered a devastating Korean War. It was still recovering. It was one of the poor countries in the world, and so it received a lot of ODA, including from the World Bank. So at that time, there was a bank office. Usually the World Bank has offices in countries where we have projects. And so Korea was one of those offices. And then as Korea became richer, as it actually succeeded, in some sense, the bank's mission is to make sure that the bank becomes irrelevant in a country. I mean, you can view it that way. And in that sense, Korea was a success story. The World Bank no longer needed to be here because Korea was, in fact, becoming a donor country, what we call a donor country, which means instead of receiving projects from us, they actually invest in the bank so that the bank can help other developing countries because Korea was no longer a developing country. In a few cases in developing countries, the World Bank has an office to work with the donor country. In East Asia, for instance, we have offices in Singapore, also in Tokyo. So the main purpose of the Korea office is to take advantage of local partnerships, both with the government, public institutions, and private partners. So it's what I characterize as a partnership office. So we would work with the Korean partner to work on Vietnam, for instance. And this could mean utilizing Korean resources. The Korean government is quite generous in supporting the Korean office. It could be working with a Korean partner because Korea has a lot of expertise and knowledge, and Korea is in fact a very sought-after partner for many of our developing country clients. So that's really the purpose of the office, and it's a quite different office than most of our offices.
Right, I think since President Moon Jae-in's new Southern policy, I think Vietnam has been quite highlighted in recent news as well. But even as you mentioned in other interviews, you know, Korea is an attractive case study to many nations, developing nations who see Korea as an example. So, you know, Korea could be deserved for the title Ideal Model of Economic Development. Do you think the World Bank or even the world recognizes this?
I think so. I think from my personal experience, you know, I've worked on South America, Africa, and of course East Asia. Everywhere I've gone, there's been quite a lot of interest in learning from Korea and working with Korean partners. And I think one reason is because Korea is one of the few, this transition that I described from being a recipient to a donor country, that's a very rare development. It's a very rare instance. Most of the advanced high-income countries that you see today, such as European countries and the US, those countries developed quite a long time ago. So Korea is one of the more successful recent cases of development. So this case study of a country which was a fairly recent success story in development from a very low baseline, from a very underdeveloped state, I think gives Korea a very appealing and credible case study for a lot of our clients.
Well, we are talking about the role of the World Bank Group Korea office, so let's take a closer look at what this organization does.
This is the Korea office of the World Bank Group, located in Yeonsu-gu, Incheon.
Hi, my name is Samir Goyal. I'm the Program Manager for the Seoul Center for Financial Sector Development. It's a partnership between the World Bank and the Government of Korea, primarily executed through my practice, which is the Finance, Competitiveness, Innovation, Global Practice, and the Ministry of Economy and Finance. So this partnership primarily focuses on strengthening financial systems in East Asia and the Pacific, and it came into being in 2012, and we located to Korea office in 2015 July when I moved here. Since we have moved to Korea, we have had the opportunity to build some 30 plus partnerships with institutions in Korea, which have the knowledge and which have the expertise, and we've been able to connect them to several countries in East Asia and beyond East Asia with bringing their expertise and their knowledge to support the reforms in those local countries. What's different in the Korea office from the other offices is that this is a donor-funded location. It's basically, Korea doesn't need our support anymore, but it wants to have a stronger role in East Asia and supporting other countries. The Seoul Center partnership allows us to connect with the key experience as well as the key expertise that resides in Korea and which Korea has developed over the years, and that our presence here allows us to connect it to several countries in East Asia.
Hello, my name is Catherine Kelm, and I am a Senior Land Administration Specialist with the Global Land and Geospatial Unit. So my work with the Korea office is twofold. First, it's to develop partnerships with Korean agencies to share their experience and capacity building with other countries. And the second is actually to go to those countries and implement development and reform programs. So for example, Korea's focus on technology and innovation is helping other countries learn and leapfrog ahead using technology and innovation. For example, we're using drones to do faster and better mapping and starting to see the world in 3D mapping. So the Korean experience and the Korean technology and the companies are helping other countries in the region learn and improve their mapping capabilities.
Korea provides an inspiring example as the first country to go from being an aid recipient to an aid donor and member of the OECD Development Assistance Committee. The World Bank Group Korea office shares that example with developing countries. We look forward to the office continuing to do its part to make the world a better place to live for all.
So the World Bank Group Korea office cooperates with both governmental and private organizations in the country. So that's to provide technological support to developing nations. Can you tell us about some of the projects the office has done with private institutions now?
Our projects are actually, in some sense, technically, they're not our projects. We're the bank, so we lend to the project, but the projects are actually owned and operated and managed by the government, either the federal, some part of the government, or in a few cases by public institutions, for instance, a state-owned enterprise, for instance. But basically, our focus is, and our counterpart is the government, the public sector. Now, we have other parts of the World Bank Group, such as probably the biggest is IFC, International Finance Corporation, and their main counterpart is the private sector. So what they do is they lend to the private sector. They can also invest in private sector. They can invest in private projects, for instance. We have another sister organization called MIGA, Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, and they similarly work almost exclusively with the private sector, and their job is to promote foreign direct investments in developing countries by offering something called the political risk insurance, which is a guarantee. So these are the type of engagements that help developing countries attract private investments.
Right,
Yeah.
so this is all part of the global economy, right?
Yes.
The World Bank Group released a flagship report called the Global Economic Prospects every January and June as well. And according to the recent report, global growth is expected to slow down 2.6%. What are the causes, perhaps the threats as well?
Well, I think there's many causes, but it's really, in some sense, part of a trend since the global financial crisis in late 2000, so 2007 and 8 or so. So what we've seen is a decade trend of lower rates of growth of investments, lower rates of growth of global trade, for instance. So I think that's feeding into the weakness in the global economy in general. And of course, added to that is the recent trade tensions.
Right.
And that creates direct impact in terms of higher tariffs. That directly feeds into lower trade activities, global trade activities. And you're talking about two of the largest economies in the world. And then we have a situation where there's a lot of interlinkages among economies through the global value chain. And therefore, there's a propagation effect through the trade tensions. And what you see is when you have less trade going on between, let's say, the US and China, countries like Korea suffer because Korea provides many intermediate goods into Chinese exports into the US, for instance.
The president of the World Bank Group also mentioned that countries should urgently make significant structural reforms that improve, the business climate to make the economy grow and attract investments. So, what are your thoughts about that?
In order to make sure that the economy is growing, you want to make sure that productivity is improving. So, and a lot of times you see a country that was able to develop from a very poor initial stage was because the structure of the economy changed. And in the case of China as well as Korea, what you see is that initially you had a very large agriculture sector, a large population in the agriculture sector, which not all of them were very productive. And you see a big migration into, especially in the case of China and Korea, into the industry sector. And that fed into the restructuring of the economy. And that's the type of restructuring that really can drive growth as opposed to simply just investing more in infrastructure and so on. You can do that. I think the single most important thing is to promote market competition. For instance, in a lot of countries, such as in Korea, one of the big priority is to promote entrepreneurship, to promote startups, to produce the next unicorn, to take advantage of fourth industrial revolution. But that requires new venture firms entering into the market. So you can think about how to promote those types of venture startups. Are they accessing the financing needed to enter the market? Are there market barriers to entry? Are there regulations? Are there companies already in the sector that are sort of preventing the new entrants, for instance, and so on? So that creates, by opening up sectors to these new entrants, you create more competition, and these entrants can bring in new technology and new ways of thinking, et cetera. And that creates more market expansion, for instance. So you want to make sure that the market essentially functions so that the best competitive, most productive firms are the ones that are able to win market share.
Sure, yeah. Fair competition, equal playing ground, all keys to economic growth. Well, last but not least, can we ask what are your future plans of the World Bank Group Korea office? Also, your goals as, the special representative of the Korea office as well.
Well, my overall goal is to make sure that the Korea office makes or maximizes its contribution to development, to the World Bank's work in other developing countries. So that's sort of my top level goal. How would you achieve that? And I think one of the most important things for us, being in Korea, is to take advantage of local expertise and local partnership. So one of my big goals is to continue to expand and deepen the partnership. But I also want to do the same for international partnership. So for instance, I think we mentioned Vietnam at the beginning of the conversation. Vietnam is one of the biggest ODA recipient from Korea. And there's a reason for that. They're very interested in learning from Korea and working with Korean partners. They see Korea as one of perhaps the top economic development case study or model. And so I think I see more potential for partnership, and in fact I see more demand from Vietnam partners and clients to work with Korean partners. So I think the Korea office, in fact what we have been doing is we've been working with our Vietnam office in Hanoi to explore areas where there is demand and supply, meaning what are the areas that the Vietnamese would like to work with Korean partners. One of it is something called smart cities, which is how do you use technology and how do you better manage urban centers. And so we're looking to see, and Korea has some comparative advantages and expertise in this area, so we've been working with Vietnam partners to see how we can develop that agenda more. So those are the kind of things that I think I look forward to doing more while I'm here managing the Korea office.
Well, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your insights for today. We talked about the role of the World Bank Group Korea office, also the prospect of the global economy. Certainly hope it continues to play its part as it helps developing nations as well, sharing Korea's economic development, whether it be to Vietnam and other nations as well. Of course, we are hoping that it could share its know-how as a major knowledge sharing hub. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you.
That's all the time we have for today. If you have any questions regarding Korea's economy and what goes on around the world, feel free to join us on social media where we'd love to answer your curiosities. We'll see you next week, same time, same place on The Chamber. Thank you again. I think we're going to have to...